I think context windows in AI should be minimal and smaller than bigger, larger as the trend is going right now. Here's why. Let me just build upon a quote by Sam Altman, which I think sets the right type of background for this conversation to happen, right? So Sam Altman, and I'm paraphrasing, said the perfect AI is a very tiny model with superhuman reasoning, one, 1 trillion tokens of context, two, and most importantly, and three, access to every tool you can imagine, right? So let's assume for a moment that this is the right model that will be the one to rule them all. So you've got three criteria to meet. One is superhuman reasoning, which simply means that the chain of thought, if this is a model like the ones we've presently gotten, which are transformer based, or some other type of model, which Jan LeCun, for example, is working on, which are CNN based, that may be different, but some sort of reasoning mechanism. Two is the trillion tokens of context, right? So this means the AI has the ability to uh, parse up to 1 trillion tokens of context, which I don't think any one of us can understand how big that number is. I think this is larger than most books of even, let's say, 1,000 pages. And three, access to every single tool you can imagine. I think this is the most approachable one. This just means that it has access to your Gmail, WhatsApp, Twitter, LinkedIn, etc., right? So it has unlimited context on you. Now, I would argue that of these three, only the first and the third one is required. Superhuman reasoning is required because you need an AI to compete on the same intellectual battleground that humans compete on, which I think makes sense because if you want to replace humans at something, you have to be at least intelligent enough to compete with them at most benchmarks. And this is computationally intelligent, not just based on training data. I think uh, you can look at my previous video on that to understand what I'm talking about there. So superhuman reasoning makes sense, and access to every single tool you can imagine also makes sense. But a trillion tokens of context is simply a number that we can throw around, but means absolutely nothing in terms of model performance, right? An example of this, uh, Google's Gemini model has the biggest context window of any single model that I know of, which is, I think, 2 million tokens input. And its performance, although very, very good, is on the same level, uh, uh, assuming this is on coding and reasoning benchmarks as a O3 model or a Claude model, right? So, and all of these have less than 1 million tokens of input context. And so once you've recognized that, you start to think whether a doubling down on the number of tokens has any major effect on model performance at all. And I would argue not. Instead, what really matters to an AI is the ability to pull the right context from that prompt, from that input token, and then use it to call these tools or use its superhuman reasoning. But how do we make it so that we limit the number of tokens and also increase the ability of the AI to be better at parsing the prompt, better at parsing the input tokens that it has? One, you have to recognize the fact that by allowing as much text to fall into the AI as uh, as we can, let's say if we somehow allow 1 trillion tokens of context into the prompt, there is simply no way that an AI, as good as it might be, would be accurately pulling the right set of things from the right set of data. Because end of the day, if humans with their present human amount of reasoning cannot accurately parse the completeness of a book, which is much less than 1 trillion tokens, what makes us assume that a superhuman model, whatever that might be able to parse a trillion tokens of context regardless of how good its RAG is, regardless of how computationally intelligent it is. So that's one. Two, I think we also have to recognize the fact that simply feeding context into a prompt doesn't mean the prompt is good. Sometimes context is the downfall or the straw that breaks the AI's back, right? What do I mean by that? I have an example where I ran Claude on my device and I asked it to use my Gmail. So, Gmail is the tool call in this case, and identify whether a specific email that I got is a mass marketed email in the sense everyone who is part of a mailing list got it, or it is a personally sent email, right? What I did was I gave it some additional context, which was like, uh, Claude, I think this is a personally targeted email. So this is the additional context, right? And assume that this is, so my prompt was less than 300 tokens. In 1 trillion tokens, there's so much space for human inputs, right? And as soon as I let Claude to believe that I think this is a human who's on the other end sending me this mail personally, then it had the inherent bias due to sycophancy uh, to assume that indeed I was right and give the male the benefit of the doubt, which should not have happened. So this means that a 1 trillion context window is poor for AI performance because of the inherent biases that come with a prompt. So how do we improve uh, the performance of a model without having unbelievably large context windows, right? I think the way to do that is simply to allow your databases to be tool calls. So what I mean by that is rather than having any prompt on the other end, there will be some sort of prompt which would be like pull my emails or give me this email from this day. There must never be a moment where it is the prompt's context window that is playing a part in determining the action that the AI takes. And a subnote here, of course, I know that the tool call outputs and inputs would be a part of the AI's context window, but what I mean right now is, regardless of how big these tool calls are, the initial prompt, the system prompt plus the user prompt must not reference uh, must not be large enough so as to divulge the AI in biases that will be human inflicted largely. What that means is we allow context windows only large enough that tool calls can be passed well. And a good tool call, for anyone who's built this, knows that a good tool call is a tool call that returns the minimal amount of output with the maximal amount of inputs, right? So this is the ideal REST API case where you get as much input from the front end as possible, which allows you to send as specific an output from the back end to the front end as possible, which is also the makings of a good tool call, in my opinion. And I think if that is the case, then that means that rather than having a million, uh, a million token long context window, what we instead has have is, let's say, 100,000 uh, token context window, and everything else that includes the user prompt, the chat before that, becomes a tool call that can be referenced in and of itself, right? So every new chat message is a tool call in and of itself, which references the previous chart history and sees if it is required. If it is not required, there's no need to reference the previous chart history as well. Also, uh, this then becomes a part of the larger tool calling mechanism that comes with the AI rather than separate systems for tool calling and for prompting. So that is my 2 cents. So just summarizing my opinion on this, I think Sam Altman is right in saying that a good model will be a tiny model. And remember, this needs to be a tiny model as well. We've not even touched upon that, but let's just assume that a tiny model is self-serving. A tiny model with superhuman reasoning, which is required if you want good tool calls and access to every tool you can imagine, which is also important since you need the largest amount of uh, context regarding the user, but a small context window. So this context is more specific, is free from biases, and helps the AI do something in the next tool call rather than saving and storing stuff for the larger workflow, which won't make sense since this model is already superhuman in its reasoning, right? It does not need uh, data to basically overcompensate for its reasoning, which what present models are doing. They get the largest amount of data and then overcompensate their lack of reasoning with this data. What we rather need is a computationally intelligent reasoning model, which is smart enough to extrapolate from data with the smallest possible subset of data, which removes any sort of biases that might come from training AI. Right, so that is my 2 cents. Excited to hear what someone who's building in this space might have to say about this. Thank you.